please help me welcome to the stage Doug Shaw with the Opportunity Groundwater Conservation.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Can y'all hear me? I know at some point I'm going to yank one of these cords out and it's going to look ridiculous. You guys got my presentation up? Maybe, sort of. How many of y'all have heard of the Opportunity Groundwater Conservation District? Some of y'all? Hopefully we weren't too much of a nuisance to you guys. Most of y'all, when you hear from us, it's either you're a municipality and we're bugging you about getting your reports to us, or you're trying to drill a private well and we're telling you you can't put it here, you got to put it over there. We really are more than just a nuisance, I promise you. If you guys would flip the slide. So before I get started, I want to thank everyone that showed up for our grand opening. We recently were fortunate enough to build a new office up in Springtown. We'd been renting a place up there. It wasn't very great, but we built a new place. We've been saving up for years. All the chambers that in the 4 counties we work with showed up. East Parker County was there. We really appreciate you guys being there and helping us out. And I just want to thank everybody involved. And any of y'all, if you're up in the Springtown area, come see us. We've got some really cool stuff up there I'm going to talk about here in a second. If y'all go to the next slide. So who are we? Who is the Opportunity Groundwater Conservation District? We were created by the legislature in 2007, which went to the vote in November of 2007. The voters in the 4 counties approved the creation of the district. And we're responsible for managing groundwater in all 4 of these counties. If you go to the next slide. So how many folks are familiar with surface water and groundwater law management in the state of Texas? I'm going to know some of the folks with the cities. I know you guys are. Texas is actually one of the only states, definitely the only state in the Southwest, that treats groundwater and surface water completely differently, right? 2 completely different sets of laws. When the water's under the ground, it's managed under one set of laws. As soon as it comes out of the ground in a spring, naturally comes out of the ground, enters a water course, under a different set of laws, moves down the stream, hits a fissure in the ground, goes back in the ground, a different set of laws. Texas does not recognize the interaction between the 2. It's one of the downsides of our water law in this state. However, surface water, for the most part, is managed through a prior appropriation system, right? We talk about the water in the lakes and streams. I'm not going to ask, there's too many people here, but most folks don't realize there's only one natural lake in the state of Texas. All the rest of the lakes are man-made. For the most part, made for water supply, a few for flood control, or both. Groundwater, on the other hand, is a private property right. Did you go to the next slide? And almost everybody knows that groundwater is a private property right. But most folks don't understand or don't know how it became a private property right. And it started with a Supreme Court case in 1904. And what happened? This happened up just south of the Red River, north of Dallas. A gentleman by the name of Mr. East had a piece of property, had a small, shallow well. It was his only source of water for his family, his livestock. Railroad company came in, bought up the property next to him, drilled a really large well. His well went dry. Mr. East sued the railroad company, went all the way to the Texas Supreme Court, and the Texas Supreme Court said, "We're sorry, Mr. East, that's the railroad company's right." It became known as the rule of capture. And in that Supreme Court decision, they actually referred to groundwater, that I have it up there, as being so secret and occult. Because at that time, nobody had any understanding of how groundwater worked. You just knew you could dig a hole, you could drill a well, and water was under there. Sometimes, sometimes not. Well, if you go to the next slide. As we move forward, in 1917, the legislature passed the conservation, or they approved the conservation amendment, went to the voters of Texas approved that amendment to the Texas Constitution, which basically said, or says, it's the duty of the Texas legislature to protect all natural resources in the state of Texas, including groundwater. So that happened in 1917. Nothing much happened in the ways of groundwater management for about 32 years, actually. In 1949, legislation was passed that allowed for the creation of groundwater conservation districts like ours. What drove that decision was up in the high plains of Texas, you'd recently at that time started to see a lot of irrigated agriculture. Cotton farming and corn and irrigated corn in the Panhandle and high plains of Texas is actually the largest user of water in the state. There are counties up there that produce more water to put on cotton than the entire county of Dallas County uses for everything. It's a tremendous amount of water. They saw some water level declines, said we probably ought to do something about this. And so rather than create a state agency, so go to the next slide real quick. Right now there's almost 100 groundwater districts in the state. Go to the next slide. These are the major aquifers. I'm going to go through these quick so you can see. These are the major aquifers in the state of Texas. Go to the next slide. Those are the minor aquifers in the state of Texas. So the reason the decision was made to create local districts rather than a single state agency was really twofold. One of them was because there are multiple aquifers, as you've seen, around the state of Texas. All of them act very, very differently and need to be managed differently. So the thought was we need to have local districts that manage portions of aquifers based on the way that aquifer works, based on the way it produces water, based on the way what water levels are doing over time, rather than having one state agency that just kind of blanket rules that apply to everyone, right? The second reason was because groundwater is a private property right, they wanted the decisions to be made by local folks that are actually impacted by the decisions, right? So instead of having some folks in Austin that you're never going to see appointed by the governor making these decisions, our board is appointed by the county commissioner's court. Some groundwater district boards are locally elected officials, but they're local folks, right? So that was the two reasons for creating local districts like ours. And going back to the reason for the multiple aquifers, even the same aquifer in the same county can act very differently from one side of the county to the other. And it's just because geology varies greatly across these areas. So if you go one more slide. The reason we as a district was created, so in early 2000s, the TCEQ does these studies around the state where they look at areas where there's some concern for what groundwater levels are doing. It's called the Priority Groundwater Management Area Studies, PGMA for short. The state loves their acronyms, right? What they found, so this map up here shows water level declines, groundwater level declines in the entire state of Texas in the major and minor aquifers. What you see is the largest water level declines recorded in the state of Texas and actually in the country center under Arlington, Texas. So that dark red spot up there in North Texas, just east of where we are, those are Tarrant and Dallas County, and then south of us in McLennan County, around Waco. And basically what that means is from the first time water levels were recorded back in the 30s, 40s until the early 2000s, in some parts of Tarrant County, you see up to almost 1,000 feet of water level decline from the first recorded water levels. That was largely driven by, before all the lakes in North Texas were created, all the folks in Tarrant County and Dallas County and the surrounding areas all depended on groundwater. Now they've all transitioned over to surface water, but there was a tremendous amount of groundwater pumped during that time that caused these water level declines. But it's interesting to see there's a lot more water pumped out of the Ogallala and the High Plains and in the Panhandle than out of the Trinity group of aquifers, but it acts differently. There's still great declines up there, but not near the declines we've seen in the Trinity. So you can go to the next slide, please. This is just a map of the groundwater area of North Texas. Basically what the TCEQ said in that study was, we see reason to create groundwater districts, and local counties, local leadership, you can get together and create your own groundwater districts, or we're going to create a groundwater district for you. The thinking at the time, I wasn't around, I was at the Water Development Board at this time, but I think the thinking was our 4 counties, Hood County, Parker, Wise, and Montague, didn't really want to be lumped into the same district with Tarrant and Dallas County. Generally speaking, when that happens, the more populated counties tend to drive the boat. That's just my experience of being around the state. If you go to the next slide, this is just a map of the Trinity Aquifer. I'm sure everybody here has heard people refer to the Paluxy and the Trinity, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means in a second, but let's look at the footprint. The Trinity Aquifer is one of the major aquifers in Texas. It actually goes up into Oklahoma, but pretty much all the way to as far northeast as almost to Texarkana, all the way down to San Antonio. It dips really deep and is below the Edwards down there. Once you get south of the Colorado River that runs through Austin, it actually transforms into a very, very different aquifer. So when we talk about the Trinity, we're usually talking about the Trinity Aquifer above the Colorado River, basically from Austin up to where we are. What you see up there is on the far left, the dark green, is what we call the outcrop. And if you'll go, actually I have 2 slides from now, I've got something that explains the outcrop. But if you would go to the next slide real quick. This is a cross-section of the Trinity group of aquifers across Parker County to the far left, across Parker, Tarrant, Dallas, and Kaufman County. So the Trinity aquifer is a dipping aquifer, as most sand-based aquifers in the state. Let me back up a second. Has anybody here heard of the Edwards aquifer? If you ever spend any time driving in Austin, west of San Antonio, west of Austin, you see, Caution, Edwards aquifer recharge zone. The Edwards gets a lot of publicity. It's what we call a karst aquifer. It's basically caves full of water. Water, it responds to drought in the same way that lakes do. Water levels fall when you're not getting rainfall, and you can see water levels come up 30 feet with a big rain. That's really the only aquifer in Texas that acts that way. All the rest of the aquifers are sand-based aquifers. They're basically like sponges. And all the airspace between the sand molecules saturate with water. And you drill a hole down into it, water moves into the path of least resistance into that hole. And the amount of water the aquifer produces is really the amount of water that the sand will push into that hole. So the Trinity group of aquifers is actually a dipping aquifer. It dips towards the Gulf Coast. It's hard to see from where most of you guys are, and I had a laser pointer, but it was out of batteries, and we stopped and looked for one. That's another story. It's hard to find laser pointers, apparently. What this cross-section shows is a couple things. It shows how where we are in Parker County, the aquifer is the closest to the surface. It's also the thinnest and least productive. As you move east, it gets deeper and thicker. When you're looking at this, the different colors are the different formations within the Trinity. So the yellow represents sand, which is where the water is. Blue represents limestone. And then the brownish color represents clay or shale. There's water in the limestone, but it's not nearly as productive as the sand. So on the top right corner, that's the Woodbine. That's a minor aquifer that sits on top of the Trinity. The blue below that is the Ouachita-Fredericksburg. That's another minor formation. Most of the limestone you see outcropping around here, like if you're driving through Granbury towards Granbury down 377, that limestone you see cut in that's Ouachita-Fredericksburg limestone. And then that thin yellow line below the first blue line is the Paluxy. So the Paluxy is the uppermost water-bearing formation of the Trinity aquifer. Below the Paluxy, you have the Glenrose, which is predominantly limestone and separates the Paluxy from what everyone calls the Trinity. What everyone refers to as the Trinity is actually, geologically speaking, referred to as the Twin Mountains. And it's 3 lower formations that we lump together because in this part of the world, they're all sand. And that is below the Glenrose. So you can see that yellow where the Paluxy is pinches out about halfway through Parker County, about halfway past. Really, once you get to Weatherford, you can get west of Weatherford, there's no more Paluxy, right? What everybody calls the lower Trinity or the Trinity is outcropping and coming close to the surface. And like out around Brock, all those wells that people maybe refer to as Paluxy wells are actually in the Twin Mountains or the Trinity. It's just very close to the surface. You go through that, you're into an older formation that's called the Strawn. The Strawn is much, much older and full of hydrocarbons in some areas. Some of y'all may be familiar with Silverado and the Brazos. Yeah, I hear some folks laughing. And people out there lighting their water wells on fire, that's because of the Strawn. Underneath Fort Worth, the Strawn's like 2,000 feet below surface. It just happens to come up just the same way the Trinity group does, comes up very close to the surface. And it actually outcrops in Palo Pinto County. And all the crazy water and mineral wells, that's all in the Strawn formation. It's full of all kinds of stuff. It's much, much older than the Trinity group. So this is what the aquifer looks like. If we were to just cut the earth in half and pick it up, this is what it looks like. You can go to the next slide. So a minute ago, I mentioned the word outcrop. So this is kind of a really easy, simple way to explain what the outcrop is. And pretty much the entirety of Parker County, one portion of the Trinity is outcropping. Another way to look at the outcrop is also the recharge zone. It's the only place in an aquifer where water can get back down into the aquifer. All right? It's also worth noting that, so if I were to tell you on this picture here, that middle tree, that's probably the Parker-Tarrant County line. So we have a small portion of far eastern Parker County that does down dip or subcrop below the surface. And what outcrop means, it means there's no confining layer that separates the aquifer from the surface. So there's not a thick layer of clay, limestone, shale that separates the water sands from the surface. Another interesting thing is the way the outcrop produces water. So in this diagram, you see 3 wells. And if you'll notice, water level in those 3 wells is pretty similar. So in the outcrop, the water level in the well is actually equal to the water level in the sands. As you move down dip, water levels in the well are far above the water level in the sands. That's caused by the pressure. So you have this confining layer setting on top of the aquifer, and then all the water up dip puts pressure. And when you pierce through it, water comes up the borehole. And then all the way to the right, you see water levels above the surface. That's what's referred to as artesian pressure. That's an artesian well. When the water comes all the way to the surface, that's what we mean when we say artesian well. So in this particular diagram, that well on the outcrop, it might make anywhere from 10 to 25, 30 gallons a minute. That's about it. This well in the middle might make 300, 400, 500 gallons a minute. This well on the far right, that might make 1,500 gallons a minute. And so this is one of the reasons, like you move over, I know of a well over east of Denton that makes 1,300 gallons a minute. It's in the same formation as the lower Trinity, which if you'll talk to the public water providers here that have wells in the lower formation, what do you guys make, 60, 70 gallons a minute? Good well. A good well. The same sands in east part of Denton County are making 1,300 gallons a minute, right? So it's all the geology. It's the way it was formed. If you go to the next slide. So let's talk about how an aquifer recharges. Because a lot of folks, and I hear this a lot, oh, it's been really wet. I remember in 2015, folks were telling me, we saw the Memorial Day rains, all the lakes filled up. People were like, oh, the aquifer's full, right? Unfortunately, no. It's not the way it works. So if you'll hit it once. So we have 3 kinds of recharge. We have total recharge, rejected recharge, and effective recharge. Total recharge in the entire Trinity aquifer, this is the entire aquifer I showed up there, is about 1.76 million acre feet. An acre foot is 325,851 gallons. It's the amount of water it takes to cover an acre of land a foot in water. That's about 4.5% of rainfall. That's total recharge. Of that, 99% is lost through rejected recharge. That's spring flow, base flow into another formation, or a lot of it is actually lost through evaporation, through invasive species. For an aquifer to recharge, the root zone has to be completely saturated. Right? Just like think of a sponge. A dry sponge and you're dripping water on top of it, water's not going to drip out the bottom of it until it's saturated. That's the root zone. And until that root zone's saturated, water's not going to pass through into the aquifer. Before humans were here generations ago, Texas was predominantly North Texas was predominantly rolling hills, grasslands. Now we've got all these mesquite trees, the salt cedar, the junipers that have roots that are 20, 30 foot deep. So you've basically got the top 20 or 30 feet that has to saturate before water can pass down into the aquifer. And those invasive trees are pulling that water up and evaporating it back out into the atmosphere. Which means only about 14,000 acre feet per year is making it into the entire Trinity aquifer. That's the Paluxy, that's the Glen Rose, that's the lower Trinity, the Twin Mountains. About 14,000 acre feet a year. In the entire aquifer, about 500,000 acre feet a year is being taken out. So fortunately, there's a tremendous amount of water down there, but what we know is we're taking out a lot more than is going back in, which is why groundwater districts like ours exist. Go to the next slide. One other thing I want to show you guys, in Parker County, when our district was created, a lot of the concern was due to oil and gas activity, which was pretty great. What this shows is the type of water, how much water is actually used, how much groundwater is actually used in Parker County. So in this chart, the blue bars represent public water supply. So that's your cities, right? That's the city wells, that's the water they're producing. The orange bars represent oil and gas water use. So at their peak, they got up to be about half of what public water supply was using. You can't see, there's a gray that's commercial use. It's very, very small. That yellow line running across the top represents exempt use. These are private domestic wells and also livestock wells. So we exempt all domestic use, all livestock, all agriculture use. It's actually the largest user of water in Parker County. And why that is, if you go to the next slide, this is last year. Last year for our entire district, we processed 1,180 new well applications. 623 new well applications in Parker County. That was #1 in the state. As a matter of fact, I've got a figure that looks back to 2005, and since 2005, Parker County's seen more new wells drilled than any other county in the state. I think of those 10, 12 years, all but 3 or 4 of the years. It's just every single year, this is consistent year in and year out. Anywhere between 450 to 600 and some odd wells per year being drilled in Parker County. In Wise County, it's starting to have, Wise County, when I came on board, it was about 200, now it's up to almost 400 wells a year. Montague and Hood, much lower. The average county, I think if you go past the top 20 counties in the state, it gets below 50. So you've got 200 counties in the state that drill less than 50 wells a year, and then the top 10 drill most of them. The reason this is part of what I was showing in those diagrams earlier. We're blessed. We're setting on the outcrop. There are very, very few places in the state of Texas where you can make a productive well for less than $10,000. In Parker County, you can. You know, I think average cost for a typical Biloxi or shallow well in the western part of the county is, you know, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 per well. I mean, if you were to go into Denton County, you're paying $20,000, $30,000, you know, for a well to make that kind of water, good water, because you've got to go down so much deeper. And we're just seeing a lot of the subdivisions that are coming in Parker County. They're coming in out in the rural areas where there's either there's public water supply, but the main line's far away, or there's no public water available. So you're seeing you know, 2-acre lots with a well at every lot. And this is what we're seeing across Parker County. If you go to the next slide, that's really, I mean, like I said, that's just something. I'll back up a little bit and talk about that. There's the largest groundwater district in the state is out around Lubbock. It's 18 counties. I think they process maybe 300 to 400 well applications a year. Nowhere, and when I visit with other groundwater districts around the state, when we go to conferences, and I tell them we processed almost 1,200 applications last year, they just they think I'm lying. I mean, they really don't believe me. It's so much more than anywhere else in the state of Texas. What I want to talk about here is we've got about 130, 140 wells that we measure water levels in quarterly. Some of them we actually have pressure transducers installed in that take daily water level readings. We've actually started putting in, we've actually got 2 sonic loggers in Parker County now that take water level readings every minute. So you can see water levels as the pump, and you can install those on a well that's equipped. You can watch water levels when the pump kicks on, watch how quick the water level pulls down in the pump, how long it takes the water level to recover, which is all very, very important information for us. But we do take this data, look at it around, and compare it from year to year. You know, throughout the year, like I said, we take quarterly readings. Water levels just naturally, with that groundwater that's being produced, water levels will fall during the summer and come back up during the winter. And that's because stress on the aquifer. The more people are pumping from it in the summer. And so what we do is we'll take and compare this June's reading to last June to the June before that, and we'll take, but really the important one is December. Because December is when you have the least production, the least stress on the aquifer. You get the best glimpse of what actual static water levels are. So we'll compare December, you know, to the past December readings. As you see, there's a good chunk of Parker County we don't have coverage as far as monitoring wells go. So any of y'all that actually own land, have property, have wells, contact us. It's not invasive. We come out once every 3-4 times a year, run a steel tape down your well, record the water level, and go about our business. Next slide. So one thing, I'm going to get through this real quick, we're real proud of. There at our office in Springtown, we drilled 2 monitoring wells that we're installing transducers in that we're going to take readings every 15 minutes. What we did there is based on our model, based on all the best available science. The model indicated the base of the Trinity, the base of the Twin Mountains was at 380 foot. We drilled down to 420 so we could get the logging rig down there to log it. Again, the model said the base of the aquifer was at 380. We found the base of the aquifer at 383. Our model was 3 foot off. It's pretty good. What we found, and so when you look at this middle thing, this funky looking thing, that's actually a gamma log, a well log. You run this equipment down there, it shoots gamma rays out. Sand reflects back differently than clay, which reflects back differently than limestone, which reflects back differently than sand with water in it. So if you look at this thing, and on the right side of it, you see where it kicks over? That's where the water is. So what we found is that first section up there, which is basically from 100 foot down to 150 foot or so, that's the Paluxy. And this down here, where it kicked over down here, that's the Twin Mountains or the Lower Trinity. So if you go to the next slide, we ended up drilling, like I said, 2 wells. And in the deeper well, we screened that well according to that log. Water levels at 278 feet below surface. 10 feet away, we have a shallower Paluxy well that's screened into that first section. Water levels 110 feet. It's a really cool teaching tool. Not only do we get to monitor what water levels are doing over time in wells that are not being pumped, it's a great teaching tool to show, look, you've got 2 wells sitting 10 feet apart that are producing water or have access to water from 2 completely different formations, right? They're just sitting on top of each other. And they're actually, between them, up there, the Glen Rose transitions to clay. So it's not limestone, it's clay that separates the 2. If you go to the next one, something else we're real excited about, we've partnered with the Texas Water Development Board, and they've installed a weather station at our office. It takes temperature, precipitation, wind speed, relative humidity, barometric pressure, solar radiation, soil moisture, soil temperature, and evapotranspiration, and it updates and uploads those readings online every 15 minutes. They've got that's actually the station. It's up, but they don't have it. It's not online yet. It should be online in the next month or so. You'll be able to go to www.texmesonet.org and get that data real time. Our 2 monitoring wells, the reason we're going to have them set at 15 minutes is because those are our 2 monitoring wells on the far left side of that picture. So they're actually going to be hooked into that system and be uploaded as well, water level. So you'll be able to go online and see what water levels are doing. So like I said, we're real excited about that. Again, I invite any and all of you to come by, visit with us, come look at this stuff. If you go to the next slide, the last thing I want to talk about real quick is, you might have to hit it a couple times. I don't know. There it is. And we were going to try to bring it here, but the young lady that works for us, that and our education and outreach coordinator, who you may know, Caitlin, she comes to a lot of these luncheons. She's on vacation. She's in Scotland right now, somewhere way cooler than Texas. But we've got this really great trailer that we take to schools all over the district. We take it to public events, community events. It's actually got a working model of an aquifer in it that's full of sand, and you can fill it with water. It pumps. You can show. What's really cool is, you've got a simulated well that pumps water out of the sand, and right next to it you've got a well that doesn't pump. So you can see why it's important that wells be spaced from each other, because when this well pumps over here, you can watch water level fall in the wells near it. And it's just a great teaching tool. The kids really love it. That's the aquifer there on the left, and then we've got a diagram of how a well's actually completed in there. It's the thing's large. Go to the next one. I think that's all I got. That's really all I have. Normally when I give these kind of talks, it's a smaller, more intimate kind of environment, and I have a lot of back and forth. I think there's a little bit of time for questions, like 2 minutes, but I will be around afterwards, and I do encourage, if you have any questions, come find me, ask me, get my card, give me a call, write down this information, give us a call if you have any questions at all. Does anybody have any questions? I know we have just a short time. She was first, I'll come back. Yes, ma'am.
With how many holes being pumped in the ground in Harper County, does that impact at all the pressure of water?
It absolutely does. So during times like right now, you've got a tremendous amount. So you're not going to see, just drastic water levels dropping everywhere. But what's happening is all these holes are pulling water from the sands, and they're competing with each other. So the more wells you have pulling water and competing with each other, the more stress on the aquifer, the less productive wells are going to be. Yes, ma'am.
Why was 2011 so significantly higher for public water supply?
2011 was the worst drought in Texas history, worst single-year drought in Texas history. Yes, sir.
So when do you project that we'll start seeing water shortages in this area?
What would happen, we're at a point, and it's not like, folks are just going to run out of water. what happens with sand type aquifers like this is, when you drill a well, you might make 15 gallons a minute out of it for a domestic well, and then 15 gallons a minute might go to 12 gallons a minute, then 10 gallons a minute. So you'll just slowly, and it's to a point that a lot of times you won't notice it because you've got a pressure tank sitting there, and the pressure tank's really providing the pressure to your house, and eventually you really don't start noticing it until the demand in your house the well can't keep up with that. So it may have fallen off, and generally wells fall off over time anyway, just with age. The screens, there's a lot of calcium. If in some parts of Parker County, if your well's completed at all into the Glenrose, it's going to be sucking some of that limestone in there, so it might stop up the screens. There's a number of reasons production could fall off, but stress on the aquifers is a big one.
So have y'all projected out when we'll start seeing, how far down the road will that?
So we are required by state law to do planning 50 years out and adopt what are called desired future conditions, which is no more than a certain amount of drawdown in each of these formations by the end of this 50 years. The way we've adopted that is it's to a point, and that's how we have to manage. Once we adopt those desired future conditions, we have to put rules in place to manage to that. And the way we've adopted that is it's really for a sustainable future. It might be in the western parts of the county where the aquifer's thin and not as deep. I think those DFCs, those desired future conditions, are adopted in such a way that, it might be 5 gallons a minute out there, but we did it in such a way that you're not drawing out entire parts of the county. But because so much of it is sparse, right? It's not a lake. It doesn't draw down evenly across. Water levels are going to fall down where the production is, not necessarily just because it's sand, right? So it's, really the areas of large concern is when you get a tremendous amount of production in one area, that can cause long-term sustainability issues. Yes, ma'am.
What's the cost for permitting a new well, and are they going to be charging for water usage of new wells?
So for drilling a new well, we do have an application, a registration fee. It's $600. If it's a domestic well, that's the last time you will ever have to deal with us if you don't want to ever deal with us again. We're never going to put meters on private domestic wells. State law actually, to some extent, disallows us from doing that. Commercial wells, public water supply wells, wells used for oil and gas activity, they have to report their water use to us and pay a fee on that. That's how we're funded. We're not a tax. We're a political subdivision of the state, so we're a quasi-state agency, but we don't levy a tax. So the thinking was, folks that rely on surface water, not fair for them to pay for our existence. So the communities, the public water suppliers, they have to pay us 22 cents for every 1,000 gallons they produce, and that's how we're funded. But no, as far as private wells, we're never going to meter and require any kind of payment for private wells, domestic wells. And I've gone over my time. Again, I encourage all of y'all, catch me afterwards. Thank you very much.